Ladies, Jamie, was that intro music that was just playing there?
It certainly sounded like a little bit of intro music, didn't it? Where's that come from?
Do you think it's going to effectively communicate the tone of production without alienating listeners? That was a bit of up-tempo ambient chillwave there, courtesy of my good friend and music producer from South Texas, Christopher Thomas Richardson. So do go and check out his stuff. He's a lovely chap. He sorted us out with that music there. Hello and welcome to the Human Energy Field. As always, I'm your host Henry, here with my co-host Jamie. We have a standard format episode for you guys today. I hope you've enjoyed the previous episodes, enjoyed listening to the chats we've had on Skype with people calling in, enjoyed the interview we did with Connor. It's been a fun ride so far this year already, getting off the ground and getting that interaction going, and we're both having a blast kind of absorbing new opinions and absorbing new mindsets. It's March. And you know what that means, Jamie?
What does that mean?
March means it's been a year since the last time I sat at a table with my friends and ran a game in person.
That is a long time.
Over 12 months. I'm getting the delirium tremens.
Although when people listen to this, it'll be April, won't it? So even longer.
Even longer, yeah. It's crazy. I mean, we've had a lot of online games and learn a lot of lessons, which I'm sure we'll cover later on in the episode. And there is a lot of things to be said for running online games, certainly, but more than 12 months since running something in person, man. I'm missing it.
Well, do you know who I feel sorry for as well? Tabletop players, so people who are exclusively Warhammer players who don't do any RPGs. It's got to be really hard because it's not impossible, but it's much more difficult to play a tabletop game remotely than it. I mean, at least in RPG we can all log on and do what we're doing, and as you just said, arguably play more RPGs now than maybe I would have done if we hadn't been in lockdown. But when it comes to Warhammer and Warhammer 40k, which is, Warhammer 40k, spoiler alert, we're going to be talking a little bit about that later on in the episode. But people whose hobby exists solely of miniature tabletop gaming, and I mean, fair enough, they've had a lot of time to get painting and modelling done, but in terms of actual gaming, they must be pulling their hair out, man. Yeah,
can't imagine it. I know there's a tabletop simulator, might be a substitute, but not an effective one, probably. I mean, it's the same with any kind of game. You can't beat the feeling of being in a room with your mates playing and feeding off each other's energies and having a blast.
Yeah, but especially Warhammer, something that's very tactile, isn't it? You're moving the pieces around the board and rolling dice physically. I mean, it's a much more in the moment kind of, it's almost, well, I mean, it's not LARP, is it? But, it's that kind of, it's a physical activity almost. I mean, you wouldn't believe it, but...
I mean, I feel sorry for the LARPers as well. Let's not forget about them, the forgotten ones.
Yeah, the forgotten ones, poor LARPers. Yeah, they must be having a nightmare as well. So.
Shout outs to any LARPers. If you want to LARP, get in touch, get on the Discord and set up a LARP group. I'm sure you'll find.
Do you know what? Actually, that's a good shout, because I would actually like to hear from some LARPers, because I don't speak to a lot of LARPers on Instagram. I don't personally in real life know a lot of LARPers at the minute. So anyone who's been playing in long-term games before the lockdown or planning to play more games post-lockdown, jump on the Discord and get in touch with us, or next time we do a call-in, give us a ring and talk to us about LARP, because actual, genuine, modern LARPing, I haven't spoke to anyone about it for a long time.
Well, yeah, I wonder how it's changed since the days of Magic Missile. It's the sort of thing where I have seen from afar. I've seen LARPers on field, like in the wild, so to speak. You hear about them online and you read about them online, but I'd like to meet one face to face. No, maybe we need a token LARPer in the group somewhere.
I used to have, I used to run a store. I used to run a game store, and I used to have two customers who were pretty much, I guess I'd call them regulars, and they were the only two LARPers that I had on a regular occasion. And I'm going to call them LARPers in the loosest sense of the term, because as far as I'm aware, what they did was go to the park and pretend to be Jedi, and kind of act out small self-designed kind of Star Wars dramas. Okay. Which is, I mean, that is LARP, I guess. I mean, I think one of them was playing all of the bad guys and the other one was playing what is essentially the PC. I mean, I don't know how it worked. I didn't watch them, but listening to them talk about it was was really interesting. And they always got moved on from the park because inevitably some rough lads would come along and move them on. And I'm like, well, I'm not surprised, you know. And they didn't have like fizz rep lightsabers or anything like that. So I don't know if they were just using sticks or it was purely in the theatre of the mind.
Yeah,
I don't know. I often think about those in my lonely moments. So. I miss those two guys. I mean, I don't, but you know.
Yeah, of course.
I kind of would have loved to have watched them from afar. So you know, but it takes all sorts of different gaming perspectives, doesn't it? You know, if that's what they want to do.
Yeah, and I admire the integrity that it takes to do something like that on a regular basis, and I do have a kind of admiration for LARPers in that sense, because it takes a certain kind of I don't give a fuck to go out and LARP, and I really admire that.
Yeah, I was going to say that there's a lot to admire about full-on LARPers. The care and attention they will put into kit and set dressing and things like that. And, you know, in the past I have supported people who've ran LARPs and stuff as well. For instance, somebody you know, my good friend Rory, he used to run a vampire LARP in Newcastle many years ago.
Oh, wow, I've got to ask him about that.
Yeah, and he, to the trailer version of this is, you know, he would spend a long time getting the place set up nice, and that kind of translated into people making an effort with their costumes, and I'm sure the immersion in a game like that was great. They didn't do any kind of outside LARPing though, in the kind of public and stuff. I don't know how things have changed, how you would... It must be more and more difficult to get away with that kind of what I would call public LARPing. You've got to be like right out the way, and even then, the chance of, I don't know, a lone dog walker or you know, family or whatever, it must be difficult, because you could run into a lot of problems, quite serious problems. Yeah,
well, I'm sure, and lesser serious ones, but I think at least nowadays you'd risk getting the police called for gathering. You know, it's just the boring kind of petty bureaucracy in that sense. We've got to get Rory on, talk to him about LARPing, mate. That's going to be a guest in the future for sure.
Yeah, he's probably, out of all of my my gaming friends, he's probably done the most LARPing. So, but even then, it's what I'm saying. You know, I don't know anybody. I'm going to guess it's been probably over a decade, if not more, that he's done any LARPing. So,
yes. So if you're a modern LARPer and you've LARPed in the past 10 years or more frequently, then do let us know. Get in touch with us. I'm going to set up an email for us as well, dude, because people who don't have Discord and Instagram will be able to get in touch with us through a third medium. So that's coming soon. It'll be a Gmail probably. I'll have to get around to doing that, and then from there we can set up our YouTube as well, and we'll have episodes on the YouTube. So that's all in the pipeline, guys. And just another way for you to get in touch with us via email. You'll be able to send us questions and that sort of things. Particularly if you're a LARPer, get in touch.
Yeah, I think we should do a LARP dedicated episode and get some people on and talk about it. Especially people who are doing what I would call fantasy, like LARP games. So like LARP that has rules, you know, rather than just sort of... There's nothing wrong with just theatrical storytelling, you know, in itself. And that's, you know, can be enjoyable, and that's fine. Like a murder mystery you would do at home out of a box. But I'm keen to know if there's any, you know, systems that are out there, you know, that where people have, you know, I don't know, stats or qualities or, you know, spells and all that kind of stuff. So I'd be really interested to speak to people about how that works, because I can mull through the old White Wolf Mind's Eye theatre rulebooks, you know, where all of the conflict resolution is done with, you know, stone, paper, scissors and all this kind of stuff. And it's hard to think about people playing that way now.
I love how we started off taking the piss out of LARPers, and now we're like getting really in depth about them and talking about them seriously.
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely wasn't taking the piss out. It's too wide a variety of players to take the piss out of, but I was just taking the piss out of two, and I don't even think they were proper LARPers, to be honest. I don't think they were. I just think they really, really enjoyed Star Wars and chasing each other around the park, which is fine.
Yeah, fair play to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
We weren't hurting anyone.
No, well, each other, I think, maybe. So.
All right, on to our preferred styles of gaming, I think. You recently posted on your Instagram a post about this GM magazine. I've been dying to talk to you about this. So do you want to just kind of give me a little rundown about what that is, what year it's from, and the sort of content that was inside it? Because it's like the coolest thing ever to me. It looks proper cool, that does.
All right, okay, so GM was one of a multitude of kind of late 80s, early 90s gaming magazines that were coming out to cater to the growing appeal of tabletop role-playing games. So we're talking about, you know, the height of AD&D Second Edition, you know, Vampires coming out, all this kind of big games are around, Shadowrun, Cyberpunk, and it was a real golden age of RPG gaming, and more and more players were getting into it. You know, White Dwarf magazine had been coming out a long time, and Dragon magazine was very strong, which was obviously the Dungeons and Dragons magazine. And there were a whole bunch of other gaming magazines which existed for shorter or longer periods of time. Role Player Independent, Valkyrie, Games Master International, etc., etc. And GM magazine was only ran for 19 issues, very late 80s, and was typical in that it provided a page count for all sorts of different areas of the hobby at the time. So computer gaming, LARP, PBMing, which we'll get back to, tabletop, wargaming, and role-playing. And it covered all of those in, you know, a kind of glossy magazine style format. It was a really interesting magazine. The reason I posted about it is it quite often goes overlooked. I mean, you think 19 issues is quite a lot, but I guess, you know, only out for a year or less than 2 years, and it was gone.
Yeah, that would have disappeared off the face of the earth, wouldn't it? That.
Yeah, and it was UK based, and I don't know whether it really got any wider distribution. So I think, you know, American listeners and stuff, or European listeners even, might not have come across it. And even UK players who had taken a year or two off the scene, or who hadn't got into role playing yet, may well have just completely missed GM as a magazine. And I really rate it. I don't know, I can't remember the names of the guys who did it, the editors, off the top of my head, I'm afraid. I should have wrote it down, sorry. So apologies to them if they ever listen. But they had come out the back of doing other UK magazines, and I think they were doing like don't quote me on this, but there's an Airsoft magazine I think the editors either came from or went into. And interestingly, GM magazine has some of these hybrid paintball LARP games talked about inside the pages, which is really interesting because as role-playing game was getting, you know, more popular, and then LARP's out there, it seems a perfect hybrid to put that together with like paintballing or laser tag and all that sort of stuff.
That's the sort of LARPing I'd be interested in doing, right? Getting airsoft guns out, something like that, and have a narrative going alongside whatever you're doing. It seems like the perfect combination.
Well, I used to work at Laser Quest when I was younger, when it was, you know, still a thing, at the one in Newcastle, and we quite often would put in, you know, narrative and campaign structure and stuff into kind of Laser Quest games, which was really cool, you know. So yeah, that kind of LARPing is good. But
I used to love Laser Quest when I was little, mate. I used to love going there.
It's so good. We'll not get into the difference between why it's so much better than Laser Quasar, which is shit. Do you not remember the difference?
I've never heard of Laser Quasar, mate. It must be some northern shit. I don't know what that is. Maybe,
but Laser Quest was all the black gear with, you know, the gun and the heavy kind of you know, LED thing you put on your chest, you know, the sensor and everything, and it was kind of cool. It looked like you were on the set of Aliens, you know.
Yeah, I remember. And that was great.
Quasar Laser was like some sort of bright neon orange yellow high vis plastic kid's shield that you would kind of don over you with terrible straps, and the gun was like shoddy and looked like, you know, a really bad kind of LARP rifle. It was, you know, poor man's Laser Quest, basically.
Oh, yeah, there you go. See, like we were saying, all the work and the attention to detail that goes into the kit really makes the experience.
Yeah, that's true. But what was nice about GM magazine, and you will find this in any of the old kind of retro gaming magazines about PBMs, especially earlier ones, it seems to be something that obviously, because of technology, has kind of disappeared, or rather hasn't disappeared, as transmogrified into an entirely different form. PBMing was play-by-mail, so it was quite often a GM-ran or player-to-player ran game where you would have a sheet of paper where you would have to either ask questions or write out your turn or your move, and you would send it off to a moderator or a GM, and they would tell you the results of your actions and turns and give you experience, and you would develop either your, you know, country that you were running or a character you were playing over time, and you would be able to kind of interact with other players who were in this similar PBM. I never personally played any, but you can see by the amount of articles that are dedicated to it over not just GM magazine, but lots of the magazines, especially early White Dwarfs, I'm talking like pre-Warhammer White Dwarfs. There was obviously a lot of people playing that style of game. I guess it's gaming pen pals.
Yeah.
And I guess obviously with the advent of technology and message boards into emailing and all that kind of stuff, that I guess nobody really does that anymore, and that's fine. So PBMs have been kind of absorbed into that online gaming side of things. But the breadth and depth of different PBM games is kind of mind-boggling, and they had their own zines and all that kind of stuff. Like it's an interesting aspect of the hobby which kind of gets ignored now because it just doesn't exist really.
Yeah, I think there's I'm sure there are more of those that we maybe don't mention, but there's definitely like the breadth of the hobby of role playing always astounds me when you learn there are different factors and different kind of subsectors of the role playing world where people were finding new ways or different ways to do the same thing that you're doing in your own way. It always is kind of impressive to me, one way or another, especially for listeners like myself who were still in previous incarnations during the 80s, when this sort of thing was in its heyday. It definitely can be overlooked, and there are still games that you can play by mail, like for example De Profundis, to name one. But I get the sense it's the same sort of thing people probably did with like chess and Risk and that kind of thing, where you have those long, month-long campaigns that are going on, and you post your move to the next person and that kind of thing. But yeah, I thought that was interesting. So I thought that was a good post that you made there. I was interested to hear about a bit of that. It's obviously a different era now, isn't it? Nearly 4 years.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, even zines have become a lot more popular in recent kind of months and years, probably off the back of interest in OSR style, which brings with it that kind of OSR publishing quality and the fact that you can knock something out that is low production quality, even if the content quality is quite high. So there's that kind of DIY idea that has crept back into the role-playing scene, which obviously existed much more heavily back in the 70s and 80s, but it's kind of creeping back in now. But in terms of mainstream role-playing magazines, we don't really have any. I know there are online things that you can do, and I know there's a tabletop gaming magazine, but in terms of dedicated role-playing magazines in the way that they used to exist, in the way that I'm talking about the format of GM and Valkyrie and White Dwarf and stuff, they don't really exist anymore.
Yeah, I mean, the whole print media in itself, that's a whole conversation we could have, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
There's just the way that's kind of changed altogether. People used to collect magazines, dude. People used to have stacks of them.
But I find it strange because we still, as a RPG community, obviously have a love for physical product. We haven't moved over entirely to PDF or digital, although I'm aware that a lot of people have shifted sections or their entire collections to that medium. We are still, as a player group, heavily invested in a good quality physical product. So to not have a kind of good quality physical quarterly or monthly publication, it surprises me actually. But I guess the money just isn't there to support that, in terms of purchasing and distribution and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, if big newspapers are struggling to get their things out, then I don't suppose like a niche hobby magazine would stand a chance really in this day and age.
Yeah.
But I see what you're saying. This hobby, even though it's kind of intangible in terms of the game itself, it comes with a love of the physical copy, the physical book, having something to turn over in your hands. Maybe it's because role-playing takes place in everyone's minds that we love having books so much, because it's the only thing we've got to hold on to.
It did remind me of something I do want to talk about actually, because somebody showed me on Instagram the first issue of the Call of Cthulhu role-playing. It's a magazine essentially, but I mean it doesn't come out with any particular regularity. You can get the first one off Amazon, although I'm sure you can pick it up somewhere else. Amazon was the only place I could find to buy it, and issue 2 isn't out yet, and I think it's called Bayit Al-Azif, I think. I'll double check that and I'll do a post for it. But it was I
know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it was pretty good. It as an issue, it had its ups and downs, but it was well produced, well put together, full of content, all Call of Cthulhu related. Some reviews, some adventures and scenarios, and that kind of stuff. Yeah, it was well worth a look at for anybody who's interested in that kind of horror or Call of Cthulhu side of role playing.
You're right. Beit Al-Aziv, a magazine for Cthulhu Mythos role playing games.
As far as I'm aware, there's only one issue out at the moment, but issue 2 is kind of on pre-order, I think.
Amazing. Early days for them then. Yeah, well, good luck to those guys. I hope that goes well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you could do a lot worse than pick up the first issue. I certainly enjoyed it. It wasn't the cheapest magazine, but I feel you definitely got enough quantity and quality for the money that you pay. So I certainly wasn't disappointed with what I got.
Awesome. Speaking of getting your money's worth, we brought Troika recently, didn't we?
We did. I love how that makes us sound like Bert and Ernie, like we bought it for our house. Do you know what I mean? Like we bought it for the, good night, Henry. Yeah. We did independently buy Troika. So
yeah, we in our own separate domiciles where we live separately. Yeah. But in terms of money's worth, I think that was a good purchase because it wasn't expensive and the book is a real good quality. I mean, physically, it cost me £21 to get this nice sewn spine, kind of silky hardback. I mean, the game itself, just reading through the book makes you want to pick it up and play it, and I think that's the sign of a good core book. Is just after the first few pages, you're like, actually, you know what, I really want to play this. I'm really in the mood to give this game a go.
It's very pick up and play, and I would totally like to echo your comments on the production quality of the book. It's excellent. It really is. Has been put together well. I love the smaller format of it. I love that it's hardback. It will be a very good book to carry around to a gaming session should we be allowed out of our houses again. And the page quality is good. Art is good. From that point of view, I was a little bit disappointed in the amount of content. If I had to be critical, I feel like a book with that high page count could have had more content inside of it. But a lot of it was given over. There was a lot of space misused, in my opinion, on the pages. For instance, there are 66 backgrounds which are available as essentially the character classes, and each one is given a page, and it doesn't need its own page.
Yeah, some of them is like a sentence and a few stats.
Yeah. And they easily could have got 2 a page, and that would have, even just doing that would have freed up 30 pages for a little bit of, an extra adventure or a little bit of background or some GMing advice or anything. Even just doing that little swift change would have made the game a lot better. But on the whole, I would score it highly. I think it's, it's a great little pick up and play game, especially for people who are old enough or keen enough on retro books to remember the old Fighting Fantasy. Which essentially it is in terms of system. You have your skill, stamina, and luck. It doesn't really go too much past that system. So obviously, as you can imagine, for anyone who's fought their way through the caverns of the Snow Witch or the Temple of, not Temple of Doom, Black Sand, or some of those famous places on Alancia, the Fighting Fantasy world, will be intimately familiar with the system.
Right, I remember we played a game, didn't we? I ran a game for us and some other people, and I remember we were going through the rules for leveling up a skill, and you were like, "Is this it? Is this the only thing I get to do to level up?" It's a very sparse little system, and there's not much room for character advancement other than add one number to this skill that you're good at, and then when you get better at it, add another number to this skill that you're good at.
I think it is, and you're absolutely right. In terms of mechanics, there isn't a huge amount there in the book. There isn't a huge amount to worry about. Character creation is very fast, which means you could replace characters with equal speed should your characters meet some deadly demise. But I think that's what you are looking for when you pick up a game like Troika. You're looking for something that's very easy to teach the other players. It's not like the newest version of Shadowrun or D&D where you have to read yourself through several hundred pages of rules in order to get a good grasp of it. So it has its own pros and cons there, but it certainly is a good vehicle for allowing people to get a little bit, have a little bit of fun. It's a bit lighthearted, isn't it?
It is very lighthearted, yes. It's got a very kind of British, quirky sense of humour to it, which I appreciate, and it doesn't take itself seriously. Even the character classes, when you're reading some of these character classes, and some of them made me laugh out loud, having humour in the character classes to begin with makes you kind of sets you up for the tone to play. If you're playing as a ridiculous character, like one of our players in our game was a monkey monger, he just sells monkeys to people. That's the concept for his character.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So you know off the bat already, it's going to be that kind of game. You're not going to be able to have a serious, gritty role-playing experience with these characters in this book. It's definitely a light-hearted affair. But yeah, I really enjoyed giving that a go. I did plan on running another session for some chaps in the Discord who had come off the back of the post that I'd made on Instagram talking about it. And I found a group of players, and everyone was pretty keen to play. And it came time to organise a date and a time to play, and I learned I was dealing with 4 different time zones and 4 different players with 4 different lives. And after the third, okay guys, well, what about this weekend? After the third loop of that, I just decided to put this game down like a dog. It just wasn't going to go anywhere. So that's a lesson learned there for me, I think. But what I'm going to do next time and make sure is I say, here's the date and the time that we're playing. If you can make this date and time, then come along. Instead of getting the players first, everyone was so keen to play this game that I was like, oh, you want to play, you want to play, you want to play, let's put something together. And it turned out to not be as simple as that. It's no one's fault, no one's to blame, that was just the way it went. But in terms of organising games, particularly for people whose schedules I'm not familiar with, that's a lesson that I've learned for the future now, is make sure that you set out the date and the time beforehand.
I can recommend Troika to people who want to spend what I consider a reasonable amount of money on a role-playing game, 20 quid. They will get a full system, they will get a book they can enjoy and play with very little effort, and I think they'll get the money's worth out of a book, even at full price for that. Yeah,
that was the appeal for me, is that it wasn't something like Numenera where you should run out 60 quid. It was a £20 for a hardback, which I'll happily pay for an RPG core system. It's got a good reputation. People really like it. There's a lot of talk about this game, kind of generally. You either haven't heard about it or you love it. I've noticed it's that kind of thing. It's got a big following, and anywhere you look, if you want a Troika game, there'll be one happening somewhere. There'll be someone eager to run one. It's that kind of thing. There's all kinds of different backgrounds for it you can get as well. It's got quite a large community around it.
I think they're doing an online con soon as well, aren't they? So I think if you head over to check out Troika on social media and Instagram or whatever, I think you can find the details for that.
Cool. Maybe we'll go.
Yeah, I'm not too sure. I just saw it the other day, and I kind of made a mental note to look deeper into it. I started following them on Instagram and saw that they were planning this, get together, this convention. So that'll be interesting for people who, want to see what that's about and get involved, and head over to Troika on Instagram, or it's probably on Facebook and stuff as well. So check that out. And as a kind of perfect segue to move from talking about value for money with Troika, I would then like to bring up one of my new picks for this episode, which is Jackals, Bronze Age fantasy role-playing.
I want to hear about this. It's a historical period that's quite dear to me. First of all, how big's the book? What's the art like? And is it a system in itself? Is it its own system, or is it a kind of system agnostic type thing?
Okay, so the physical book itself is a hardback, small format for anyone who's familiar with any of the other Osprey role-playing games that have come out so far, which is Romance of Perilous Lands and Paleo Mythic. Jackals follows the same production format. 272 pages, as I say, lovely, glossy page quality, nice hardback. And in terms of the fact that I think even at retail it's about 25, and online you can tend to pick it up anywhere between 20 and 25 pound, which is an absolute bargain. It's written by a guy called John Matthew DeFoggy. I had a little bit of a route around after I'd finished reading this, because I was impressed by the way that he wrote the background and the rules, etc. I couldn't see anything else he'd done, so I'm working on the assumption that this is potentially his mainstream RPG publication debut. If it isn't, I apologise, but I couldn't find anything else to the contrary. It's written really well. It's, as I've just mentioned, it's a Bronze Age fantasy role-playing. So as its point of reference, it takes in influences from books like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Old Testament or the Iliad, all of these kind of, ancient Near East kind of flavours to create its own unique fantasy setting. So I would call it pseudo-historical because it doesn't take place on our Earth, so to speak. It takes place in a geographical area which is influenced culturally by the things that I've just mentioned. There are kind of 4 initial cultures represented in the book for player characters to select from, which I'm not going to get too much into them, as an in-depth review, but they cover, cultures who are similar to the ancient Egyptians and also to the ancient Greeks, as well as the kind of Babylonians and stuff. The premise of the game, you will play the eponymous Jackals, player characters who have left the towns and villages and communities from which they were raised and have strode out onto the War Road, which is the kind of road that links all of these kind of known cities where the game is set, to strike out for adventure and profit, and basically to be heroes and have stories told about them in that kind of classic way. The basic premise of the background is that the humans had previously been enslaved by a kind of humanoid, almost Null-like race called the Takan. It's a monstrous race. And the human culture have quite recently thrown themselves out of that kind of slavery and have kind of taking back their own countries and their own cities. But obviously these monstrous humanoids are still kind of floating about in the background and everything. It's really good. It is its own system. It's a percentile-based system, which is... I'm not going to say it's rules light, because that, I think, would be to do it a disservice, but it certainly isn't complicated. It's one of these basic percentile systems where you have a skill set at a percentage, normally under 75, and you will roll a D100 and under it or equal as a success, otherwise you fail. There are obviously critical failures and fumbles and critical successes and stuff mixed up with that, and difficulty modifiers, but on the whole it's a simple D100 system which works really well. The combat system is quite dramatic and interesting because it brings in a concept where you have not just your wounds, but you have a system of valor, which is almost like fatigue. So you lose your valor points first as you fight, and then only when your valor is knocked down do you start losing actual wounds, and then you're in danger of dying. So valor can be a different level depending upon where you are in the adventure and how wounded you are and how skilled you are and everything. So it's got that nice explanation of, you don't just have 100 hit points and you fight exactly the same till 1 hit point in that kind of D&D way. You can lose that valor, and you can see as your character's getting tired and, losing the morale and all this kind of stuff before he starts getting actually hurt. So the combat system it suits the style of play very well. It treats magic very interestingly. It doesn't just present a single magic system. It makes the effort to produce one, if not more, magical backgrounds for each culture. There are ways that link them, but the kind of magic users of said cultures will interact with their deities and magic in different ways, again influenced by the cultures and stories that I previously mentioned, which is nice because it gives it a very different feel to what I would call your bog standard Western fantasy game. It's not Vancian magic. It is much more kind of Solomonic, Old Testament, that kind of magic system, which ties in, beautifully with the background. I can imagine it. I haven't played it yet because it's relatively new. It came out this year, I think. So I've only had it for a month or two, but I've been looking for an excuse to talk about it on the show, but I haven't ran it yet. Might be one of these things that I go onto the Instagram and onto the Human Energy Field Discord and get a few players to run it. There is already a supplement in the works, which is coming out in May. I've forgotten the name of it, but it's basically going to be a large campaign book There are some mini adventures in the back of the core book to get you going, but I think this first adventure will be the one where it gives you kind of, a full campaign to go through from low levels to high levels. And again, that's going to be Osprey's same format, written by the same guy. So I'm looking forward to that coming out, because the Osprey books so far have been really good, those 3. But this is the first game to get its own supplement. So there was obviously a lot of content that DeFoggy's written for Jackals that needed to go into the second book. So anyone who's interested in that kind of ancient Near East can certainly do a lot worse than pick up Jackals, because again, it's good quality for money.
Yeah, cool. I really like systems that make the combat dramatic set into the rules. Like, you're not just keeping track of hit points. It's you can almost narrate the combat through the rule set that is being used to conduct the combat, and I like it when those two things align up perfectly.
Yeah, there's enough system in there to keep people who actually like rules happy. There's some overland traveling rules, and as I said previously, the magic rules and stuff like that, and there's weapon differences and all this kind of stuff. So it's been well designed. I'm sure it's been thoroughly researched, and I'm particularly impressed that it's not an attempt to do a historical RPG. They have lovingly taken the influences from these cultures and twisted them together into a fantasy setting, which, in my opinion, becomes greater than the sum of its parts in terms of the background for a fantasy game.
That's the same kind of approach they took with Romance of the Perilous Lands and Paleomythic, isn't it, really? They made their own world off the influences.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Paleomythic is, I assume is to be set in our very, very misty dawn of time, in that kind of Conan Cull kind of way, and obviously Romance of the Perilous Land is Arthurian. Having read all of the 3 Osprey books so far, well, the Osprey role-playing books obviously, I would say Jackals is the strongest in terms of writing style, concept, and rules. I know we have played a lot of Romance of the Perilous Land, which I enjoyed, but in terms of the system, it was basically just a stripped down D&D, and there wasn't too much to it, to be honest. Paleomythic, it's got its own interesting concepts, but I think they've really succeeded with Jackals. I can see it gaining a little bit more traction maybe than the other 2.
Yeah, I think I'm going to pick that up, man. There's a certain game that I'm thinking of, that I'm sure you know what I'm thinking of, that I would like to use this system to run, and see how it fits together.
Yeah.
Maybe a Ballad of the Bloody Tower situation.
Yeah. Well, as I say, the system is simple enough that it will appeal to kind of OSR fans and stuff, but it's got that right level of crunch that it's not just 3 stats and hit points. So yeah, Jackals, Osprey games by John Matthew DeFoggy. You'll be able to find that online, easy enough for people who are interested in that.
Yeah, John Matthew DeFoggy coming out swinging with a good debut release.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, looking forward to that. I finished reading Shadow of the Torturer recently.
Oh, right, yeah, Gene Wolfe, excellent. I've been looking forward to chatting with you about this one.
Yeah, I reckon we've got enough time to have a bit of chat about this before we move on to our next segment. I own the Fantasy Masterworks edition of this book that has the first 2 books in the series, Shadow of the Torturer and Claw of the Conciliator.
Indeed.
I have started the second one after the first one, but too early to talk about. This was 1980. I read it under the impression it was written a bit earlier. It feels like something from the 70s to me, but 1980 was when the Shadow of the Torturer came out. It is a Appendix N cornerstone, but I think that's probably why I imagined it was maybe 5 or 6 years older than it is. I don't know how many different Appendix Ns there are. I don't know how many revised Appendix Ns have been out, or if it's just this one kind of...
Well, there is that original list, obviously, and people have done revised and alternate lists, because some people have even gone back and said, these are the ones Gygax forgot to put in and all of this kind of stuff. So, you can get all that apocryphal elements to Appendix N. But there is a set list that was printed in, the D&D rulebook. But you've got to remember, 1980 is still pretty much at the beginning of the hobby. The very, very early years of D&D is, I haven't done my history homework, but about 1974, 1975, I think. And that's the kind of real proto-genesis of it. So by the time, you get to, a D&D first edition and Appendix N, you're probably looking at about that time, just after then anyway. So
okay, I can see why it's in there, certainly. There's just purely for the setting, and having finished the first book, almost nothing about the setting is really spelled out to the reader. I get the feeling that I've got to read at least the next 2 or 3 to really get an understanding of what the setting is, apart from going to Wikipedia or whatever, obviously. But it seems to me to be set in a distant future that has reverted to probably medieval times. There's mentions of firearms and guns and things like that, so there's definitely some kind of more advanced technology going around. It's the story of the protagonist, Severian, who is a journeyman torturer in a guild of torturers, and after being outcast from his guild, he kind of goes off on an adventure to reach a far-off village where he's been posted to act as an executioner. So it follows the story of this character, people he meets along the way, the world that he interacts with. He's come out of this tower where he's lived all his life and is moving through this strange world, and we're kind of discovering it with him as he travels through the land. The first book is set entirely in this great city, this great walled city that he's never really seen much of, so we get to experience that with him. I really like the way that people react to Severian when he walks into a tavern, or when he walks down the street or something, because the guild that he's from is kind of historically shunned or feared, and him not knowing any better or not caring doesn't do much to hide himself from people. And it's that kind of the societal aspect to it is something that really appealed to me in that sense. There's not much action, but that's fine. I like when violence is described in half a sentence, because violence is fast and unfair, and I think reading it should be too. So in terms of the action, you'll get to the end of a chapter and there'll be half a sentence where something violent happens and it breaks the tension, and then it moves on, and I think that works really well. It's described really well. I like the way that he talks about he'll just mention off the cuff that the moon's light is green, and then you're like, what? And then chapters later, someone else is talking about how the moon has been subject to agriculture and stuff like that. So it kind of slowly develops the setting through description rather than exposition, and I think that's a big difference to make.
I don't know if you probably remember us talking about Numenera either on the show in early episodes or just, between ourselves, but I've always cited Gene Wolfe's Shadow and Claw as what I feel is one of the primary influences on Numenera. I haven't spoke to Monty Cook about it, but I'm sure he would come out and agree that that is one of them, at least, if not, many others. But I always got a real, New Sun feel about Numenera, that idea that history has gone so far forward that it has regressed in some fashion, and it's a technique that is employed, quite a few times, across that kind of fiction. But I think it's certainly best done by Gene Wolfe, in my opinion, out of all the kind of ways I've seen it done.
Yeah, I think part of creating such a wild setting like that, obviously for people who don't know Numenera, it's the same kind of thing. I think it's Earth several billion years in the future, and all these big civilizations have grown and fallen to disrepair, and then you're playing in the aftermath of these bizarre worlds.
Even Vance has that with the Dying Earth. It's the similar principle.
I think the trick with that kind of thing is to get the explanation of it correct.
Yeah.
Because you could very easily fall into the trap of having a character talk for 3 pages about the history of the world and just have it purely kind of laid out on a page for you, and that takes away a lot of the mystery of the people inhabiting the world now would feel about it, not really understanding the things that they live among, seeing them as magic or artifacts.
Yeah.
You know, like anything that we can't explain as science is magic, that kind of thing. So it would be very easy for a writer to fall into that trap and to be so excited to get his setting off the page that he fills it in the dialogue, and he fills it in the descriptions of things, and having Gene Wolfe take his time talking about the setting and take his time letting the reader kind of get used to it in their own way really helps to bring it out, I think. And the book is especially complemented at the end of the first novel by a little kind of afterword by the author, who's talking about how when he translated this works, he's had to use words that we as English readers would understand but aren't exactly akin to the world at the time, kind of thing. So it puts that little bit of extra distance between, you know, you might read the word horse on the page, but he tells you, this is the only word that I know for what this beast is. It wasn't actually a horse, but I don't have a word for it, so I'm using the word horse, you know.
Yes, and while we're talking about Gene Wolfe, you know, and that whole idea of so far forward in the future, it's kind of regressed again. Is a little comment I want to mention: the Confluence books by Paul J. McCauley. I read them many years ago, and they have a kind of similar approach to the way that, you know, Earth is, and, you know, you might get spaceships visiting, but it's almost, you know, it's just done in a very unique way, and that's the only other time that I feel it's been done, and it's been, you know, they've really hit that nail on the head, just like Gene Wolfe does. So, you know, if you want to check out if you've read Gene Wolfe and enjoyed them and you want more of the same, then check out the Confluence novels by Macaulay.
Awesome. We have been talking about Shadow a little bit in the Discord. There's always some great chat going on over there in our little space, so do come and get involved, because there's some great stuff to talk about.
Yeah, it's new, you know, we've only set it up this year, but we're already getting people on there talking, you know, about their Warhammer projects and, you know, role-playing games, and we're really keen to put people in touch with each other and get people, you know, players if they want to run a game, and get people into a game if they want to play in something. So, you know, the link is in the Instagram bio, so jump onto the Discord and get involved in the conversation. All right, and there's something else that I wanted to bring up this time round, which I hinted at on Instagram. I have just recently finished reading Drachenfels, the Warhammer Fantasy novel set in the Old World, by Jack Yeovil, brackets aka Kim Newman, writing under his you know, nom de plume of Jack Yeovil, which he also used to write the Dark Future books, I believe, for Warhammer, which are excellent. But anyway, I just finished reading Drachenfels, and I have the adventure book, which was published by Games Workshop for the first edition of the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplaying game, and it made me want to come on and talk about Drachenfels and talk about the theme and feel of those early novels and supplements, and just to give people a bit of a rundown of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay's journey as a role-playing game, and a few little tidbits here and there. I don't just want to do a readout, like anybody can go to Wikipedia and see the dates and the times, but just to give a little bit of context to that, because I know a few times we've mentioned the new version of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and I've often talking about the original version, and I think it'd be nice for players who aren't familiar with the role-playing game to have a little bit of a synopsis of, you know, how long the game's been around and what kind of incarnations it's gone through.
Lay it on me, man. Lay it on me.
All right, okay, so Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, obviously, as it says in the title, is a role-playing game set in the old world, which Games Workshop had developed for its Warhammer Fantasy Battle tabletop game. It was first published in-house by Games Workshop in 1986, so quite early. To put that into context, you're looking at 3rd edition Warhammer Fantasy, and you're talking pre-40k. So, you know, 40k came out in about 1987. So, you know, you're looking at Warhammer Fantasy Roleplaying coming out before 40k is really a thing. Obviously, it was already in the works by the two of the main Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay early supplements are crossover supplements for the tabletop game 40k and Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. They were the Realm of Chaos books, which we all know either from the originals or from the 30th anniversary reprints Games Workshop had did, and were available from Warhammer World, which many people have got hold of, and other people are probably very desperate to get hold of. Hopefully, after this whole thing,
gorgeous books.
Yeah, really gorgeous books, and really pleased that they made them available again after 30 years, and they're direct reprints of the original, which is great. I mean, I have the originals just because I've been playing that long, but I think it's great for people to be able to, spend 35 quid or whatever they are for these books. It's well worth it. So WFRP was originally published in 1986 in the first edition. In Games Workshop actually developed a subsidiary of their own company called Flame Publications to handle Warhammer Fantasy Roleplaying books between 1990 and 1992. So quite often you'll see the very early supplements of branded Games Workshop, and then they'll be branded Flame Publications, which is in essence Games Workshop. A company called Hogshead took over in 1995. This was still controlled by GW to a greater, if not pretty much entirely. Everything went through GW and had to be kind of, agreed creatively by them. Hogshead went and reprinted a lot of the material, including the core book and etc., which obviously at this point was, nigh on a decade old, and was gaining popularity and, was very popular with players. So Hogshead took over, and not only did they reprint classic rulebook and adventures, like the now infamous Enemy Within, which was the first main campaign for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which we'll touch on again when we get through to the 4th edition. But Hogshead produced new content as well. Some of the picks, the highlights for me from the Hogshead era are they did a source book on Marienburg, which is a city that's probably well loved and very famous to a lot of old school Warhammer fans. They also did Realm of Sorcery, which was a much needed revision and expansion of the magic system in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which had kind of been overlooked. And they also did one of the other big campaigns, which was Doomstones. Now Doomstones had come out earlier, Flame Publications, but interestingly, Doomstones was originally written as a Dungeons and Dragons set of adventures and then adapted to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, whereas Enemy Within was written precisely for Warhammer. So you can tell the difference in the feel between those two campaign settings. The Doomstones one is much more high fantasy, high action. It's got a lot more D&D, dungeon bashing going on than the Enemy Within. So Hogshead produced a lot of stuff and, ran for a while. Now they closed. Hogshead finished. The owner kind of sold Hogshead, which meant that the license for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay returned to Games Workshop in 2002. And there was very little support, obviously, coming out near the end, and there was a period of a few years where nothing really was happening. Warpstone magazine was probably the burning light in the darkness for any Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay fans, as it was constantly producing its well put together and well researched, I'll call it a zine, but really it's a magazine. Anyone who's a big fan of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay will already know Warpstone magazine, and anyone who is just getting into it, especially with the 4th edition, can do a lot worse than go and seek out all copies of Warpstone. Don't be surprised if they're expensive, because they are. But nonetheless, in 2004, Green Ronin came along, and together with Black Industries, which was a newly created part of GW's Black Library, combined together to create the 2nd edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. This was the first time I think it really became a modern RPG. It dragged the timeline forward a little bit. So for Warhammer Fluff fans, it took the elements of the Storm of Chaos storyline and absorbed them into the background. And it produced all new, fresh content. So Green Ronin and Black Industries did not simply go ahead and reprint any of the classic adventure modules and backgrounds. It strode its own path. It didn't reprint Enemy Within. And it did a lot of interesting source books that were often talked about and wanted, but hadn't been covered in the first kind of two incarnations of its life. So, for instance, they brought out a sourcebook which was entirely about Skaven, but not only did it describe the Skaven clans and the Skaven background, but also give you the rules to play Skaven characters, which was, absolutely amazing. It was very cool, very different thing to be done. It also had sourcebooks covering Kislev for the first time since the Something Rotten in Kislev section of Enemy Within, and Bretonia and the Border Princes and Carrick Asgol and vampires in the old world, and there was a lot of great content came out for second edition Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and I think if it wasn't for nostalgia, I would pin my hat on the fact that the second edition probably is the best. The rules have essentially been kept the same from the first edition, but they've just been revised, tidied up. I personally enjoy the first edition. That's where I started. That's the only reason. I think if I was looking to get into it now, I think second edition is probably the finest edition for newcomers. It's still got that original feel. It's still got all that real old Warhammer feel about it. The art is really good. The production quality is high. You're talking about a lot of full colour hardback books. Really beautiful set of books. They did a lot of work before Fantasy Flight came along and took the license in 2009. And they produced Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3rd edition, which by most players is universally accepted as being the worst version. Fantasy Flight did what they do and turned it into a kind of a hybrid between a role-playing game and a board game. It came in a box for the first time and included cards and counters for recording all manner of things, from wounds to skills to weapons and all that kind of stuff. Very, very different game in terms of feel. I think they wanted to try and capture the tone of Warhammer, but in that kind of board game contents way. And that's what Fantasy Flight did. They were producing a lot of very high quality board games, and during that time when they shared the license to produce Games Workshop games, they were out there doing things like Chaos in the Old World and other actual board games that were set in the Warhammer universes. But they did have the license for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And only about 5 years later, they declared that line was complete. They didn't do a huge amount of stuff for it. They kind of ended completely working with Games Workshop in terms of licensing. By 2017, everything had kind of been decommissioned and kind of gone after a kind of scale down, which left us at the most recent edition, which was kind of announced in 2017, but I think didn't come out until 2018, which was Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition, which is by Cubicle 7, which we're probably all very familiar with if we're into role-playing games. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition is an attempt to go back to the first and second editions of the game and to present that old world in a purely book format, and has really hit a lot of those nostalgia buttons in order to get people back into what they considered traditional Warhammer Fantasy role-playing, even so much that it has taken its own approach to the classic Enemy Within campaign. We're still at the beginning of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition's publishing history. I'm sure we'll see a few more things come out for them. Obviously, because of the time in which it was created, it was the first one to have a starter box, which was a nice little price point entry for players to get into it. Production quality is very high. They've got the money to put into it. It's a proven property. I think personally it lacks a little bit of the original dark humor and those kind of Lovecraftian undertones that you get from the first and to a degree the second edition. However, that being said, they are readily available, and prices on the first and second editions continue to stay high. So I would not hold it against new players who want to do some role playing in the old world to pick up the 4th edition and get into it. I think it's a very mainstream, modern version of a classic. I'm not going to say it's exactly the same, because I don't think it is, but it's a decent representation. So that's where we've got to over 30 odd years of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplaying.
It seems like nostalgia is a very big driver when it comes to WFRP. Like, the kind of main draw for a lot of these products is nostalgia for an earlier time. But apart from that, why should I play a game in the old world instead of the Forgotten Realms, or what is it about Warhammer Fantasy Roleplaying that I should go to as opposed to any other product?
All right, okay, it's an interesting question, and I think to answer that, I would have to ascertain whether you were a Warhammer Fantasy Battle fan or a Warhammer, player. And I think if you were, then the desire to play in the old world, which you know very well, would be obvious. If you're used to playing games, High Elves versus Troops of the Empire or the Orcs, and mention of Altdorf and all of these different places, the Border Princes, and the chance to wander around those lands as a player character has instant appeal. However, if you are not a Warhammer Fantasy Battle player, and obviously they've ceased to produce that game now that they produce Age of Sigmar, which is their different version set in the Mortal Realms, which has its own role-playing game, which I'm not going to get into now. It's totally separate. I actually can't give you many good reasons why you should go and adventure in the current incarnation of the old world rather than just play some other game that suits you. In fact, I would go so far as to say that it comes with its own problems, because people who are into Warhammer are really into Warhammer.
We know that very well, don't
yeah,
we?
And it'd be very easy to sit down at a table with some other people who will very happily pick you up when you've got a date or a location or something wrong. Warhammer now, because it's been around for so long, is beginning to suffer from the same thing that Star Wars Extended Universe used to suffer from, or kind of Star Trek fans, or any other big license that becomes very, very convoluted. And people who have studied it, spend a lot of time reading facts and figures, are delighted to tell you when you get something very slightly wrong. And that can be an absolute headache for any GM. So I would say that, if you're going to sit with a bunch of players who don't know the old world that well, and you don't either, and you want to make it your own, that's absolutely great. It's a little bit more grim, it's a little bit more realistic, it should have a sense of humor to it. It's more in terms of, Renaissance Elizabethan styling to its background and tech level, rather than just pure fantasy. At its base, it's humanocentric, especially if you just set it in the Empire. It's all about the interaction between the different provinces and the different nations that comprise the Empire. And of course, you have, orcs and beastmen out in the corners, but I mean, most of it is set in, civilized lands, so it's got that kind of feel about it. But no, I would say it's always really dragged tabletop players into the role-playing game. And while the old world was being supported, while it was still fresh and content was coming out and everything, I can see people getting into it. But I think from a modern gamer's perspective, who's not coming at it from a Warhammer angle, it would be difficult for me to sing its praises, if I'm honest.
Right. I mean, not that I'm holding you to account for this particular game by yourself or anything like that, but I'm just thinking from a blank slate role player's perspective. If I have no nostalgia and I don't want to play in any particular world, like I don't know what the old world is, for example.
Yeah. I think you'd be better off
with... There's no reason for me to pick this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you'd be better off with Dungeons & Dragons, because then you can at least say that it's yours, or, and to a degree, it's sad to say that the Forgotten Realms is almost getting that way now as well. It's been so well mapped and so well documented over decades of gaming history that fans of Forgotten Realms aren't quite as... zealous about the background and dates and times as fans of the old world are, but you still get that to a little bit degree. But if you could just pick up the D&D rulebook and create your own world, then you're going to reduce a lot of headaches with stuff like that. But you really have to be invested in the old world to want to play WFRP, in my opinion.
Right, yeah, it's a major part of the whole game.
Yeah, I mean it's integral to it. I think it's not that the system is particularly amazing, taken away from the background. So it exists because it existed in a certain time period. So from nostalgia, yeah, of course. But I think as a brand new game, and especially post Age of Sigmar, I wonder who the target demographic is for a 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. I can only assume it's a nostalgia product.
Yes, that's exactly my point, really, isn't it? They've made it for nostalgic fans.
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with that inherently. I suppose.
There isn't anything wrong with that inherently. It makes me wonder why they didn't make a decision to just go and reprint the early stuff.
Yeah, just reprint.
Especially if they've gone and pressed reprint on things like Lost and the Damned and Slaves to Darkness, then reprinting the original Warhammer Fantasy Roleplaying core book, to me, would make perfect sense, because that, if it's a nostalgia product, then that's exactly what people want.
And with that cover art, it'll fly off the shelves, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and I don't know if there's a licensing reason for that, or I don't know if there's an internal decision why that couldn't be done. But to me, to spend all that money and time on attempting to recapture lightning in a bottle seems a little bit pointless to me, when the first version exists, and if they still own it, to me, I would have pressed reprint on that. I'd be interested to know if there was a reason why they can't do that, rather than just, thinking they need to do something new.
Yeah, there's always entanglements, legal issues and bureaucracy and stuff like that. But after finishing Drakenfels, are you now itching to go back into that old world and play a role-playing game? Is that the sort of book that would inspire you to do so?
Yes, I think so. But it rather than inspire me to go and do it, it just reminds me how much I like Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, the early editions. I always have. It's one of those gaming product lines which I've always been a big fan of. I've always gone back to. I've always kept them on my shelf. They never spend too long gathering dust, because even if I'm not playing them, I'm kind of flipping through them, enjoying them. There's a lot to be enjoyed, especially in the Wolfe and Hogshead era. There's a lot of great content there, which is easily usable in a lot of other role-playing games as well. So to me, it's just great writing, great products by people who had a great amount of creative freedom and creative kind of ingenuity that was coming out. It was a golden time for Warhammer. It was a golden time for RPGs. So I think the stars were right for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and I think that's why it's gone down as one of those classics.
Yeah, we're talking 85, 86 here.
86 was the first edition, yeah, and then it really gained traction throughout the very late 80s and early 90s.
How old is Black Library?
Well, it's definitely pre-2000, 2004, because that's when Black Industries came out. I mean, in a way, it's a difficult question, because GW has always had a fiction element of its license, of its own thing. It's always had a kind of fiction arm. So I can't remember off the top of my head when they called it Black Library. It would have been some point, but
right.
Black Library already existed before it was called Black Library, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, even argue as far back as books like Drakenfels, for example.
Without a doubt, yeah.
Be able to take under the banner.
Yeah, because a lot of those novels were then repackaged and republished under Black Library imprints anyway. I mean, I'm fairly certain a lot of these novels are maybe still in print, because GW owns them all. So I know some of the there's a vampire named Genevieve is one of the characters in Drakenfels. She has quite a few of her own stories. She's quite a big character, and I'm sure her collected stories or whatever is available in current Black Library. So it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of those old stuff is still available.
Cool. I know our friends over at Middle-earth Crisis do a good job of talking about some of the fantasy Black Library stuff, some of the old world books.
Yeah.
So yeah, go out and check those guys out as well, because they do a good job of chatting about that stuff.
Yeah.
So coming off the back of Warhammer Fantasy into Warhammer 40k, we have a project that we've been working on that we'd like you to come and get involved in, listeners, if it's something that you have the time and the money and the inclination to do. If you're interested in Warhammer 40k and you're interested in putting together army lists, maybe writing fluff, stuff like that, we've decided to run a ongoing kind of narrative-driven tournament in 3rd edition Warhammer. Would you say that's an apt description, Jamie? Is that pretty much more or less how you would describe what we're getting up to?
Yeah, I think basically what we're going to do is we're going to give ourselves a vehicle to go back and explore a classic edition of Warhammer 40k when things were a bit simpler and creative freedom was really there. So the Forges of Nothos campaign is going to be a vehicle for us to explore things, as you've rightly said, like doing elements of fluff, developing characters, maybe bits of background, I personally am going to use it to do some writing and investigation onto some of the ideas of religion and spirituality in the 40k universe, and how it's perceived and carried out by some of the forces which we normally see stomping around the tabletop. Again, I think it's going to be something which we can maybe drag into some skirmish gaming, maybe even do some role-playing sessions set on Nothos. I think might be interesting.
I would love that.
So it's a real cross-media campaign, but at its core, we are using the Warhammer 40k 3rd edition rulebook and codexes to create armies, small armies, in order to fight against each other, and encouraging other people to either just come up with actual armies if you want to build them and paint them and share them with us on our Discord, and we can post them on the Instagram, or just come up with ideas and bounce around our ideas. However little or heavy you want to get involved, this is the genesis of it. We've only literally just kind of put our models together for this.
We have fluff in our heads. I've got a few PDFs that I can send out of stuff that I've written already, which is always a lot of fun. Writing in the 40k universe comes with a lot of constraints that I think allow you a certain kind of creative freedom when you know that you've got these points to hit in terms of the religion, like you said, or the mindset of a certain faction. Even if you just want to come and write something and share it with people about maybe an addition to the campaign, or your own idea for what an army or a character might be, then you're more than welcome to do so. We're going to set up a separate channel in our Discord specifically for Forges of Nothos for people to come and get involved in. We each also are doing a 500 point army, so as well there's going to be that wargaming side to it, so we welcome you to come along and put an army list together.
I think it's worth pointing out that we're going back to 3rd edition because we're almost presenting an earlier, if not alternate, version of the 40k universe. So we're not getting bogged down in current meta plot. We're not interested in what's happening with Gilliman coming back and Primaris Marines and all that. Forget about all of that. That's not happening. It doesn't exist. We're just doing classic 40k, which means you can do what you want, say what you want. I'm not bothered about which Space Marine force is in which quadrant in what year. That doesn't interest me at all. So this will absolutely fully diverge from canonical 40k background intentionally.
Why are we playing 3rd edition and not any of the other editions in terms of the rule set, Jamie?
I think when we talked about it, I'm old enough to have played every version of the 40k tabletop game, and for the kind of game that I think we want to play and get involved in, it's a little bit simpler. There are less ancillary elements to it, like stratagems, command points, and all that. All that's gone. It's easy to get your head around. I think it's a little bit more balanced. It's a lot easier to understand, a lot harder to break. Now, neither of us are interested in creating forces that are, broken or whatever, but by default, what you can find with a modern game is there are combinations of powers and units which behave very, very poorly in the game, very competitively, but it can break a game, take the enjoyment away from it. Whereas I know 3rd edition is it's a lot easier to find balance between the forces, I think, and you get the tactics and luck and things come into it a lot more. Everybody's going to have their own edition, a favorite edition of 40k. I totally get that. Other people are going to be screaming at me that this is the worst edition. I get it. And I'm not necessarily saying it's my favorite. Neither is the one I started with, so I'm not picking it for nostalgia version. I played Rogue Trader, but I think Rogue Trader is a much older version, which is better used for skirmish games, etc. I think 2nd edition is a little bit too childish. I think 3rd edition, the game really comes into its own. There are, in my opinion, the greatest choices for army building creativity within the codexes. For instance, the Demon Hunters and Witch Hunters codexes, which I know are dear to both of our hearts, was one of the reasons we chose 3rd edition, because they came out for that edition, and especially with the henchmen and the Inquisitors and stuff, it allows you great license to kit bash figures and create characters and add them to pretty much any other army as well.
The kit bashing is the bit that I enjoy the most out of this whole process. 3rd edition's where I started playing, so it's for me it has a certain charm to it. And the Imperial Guard 3rd edition codex is like just the greatest codex ever written of any edition, in my opinion. So the fact that you might have a chance to get a hold of that and flick through it should be enough to get you involved.
There are two. I assume you're talking about the second one, the black covered one where there's all regimental doctrines and.
Hang on, let me go and grab it, and I'll let you know.
That's the first one.
I love this book, I do. It's well good.
Yeah, that's the first one. That they're both great, but there was a second one which came out, which was more heavily focused on Cadia, because the new Imperial Guard Cadian range had just come out.
I remember that. Nah, this first one's the best. It's got all the different.
Yeah, I love them both. The first one's a bit thinner on the ground. There are a few more options in the second version of it, but yeah, they're both really good. There was a supplement for that one, which was a Catachan supplement.
Yes, I remember once playing a game and someone had combined the Catachan thing to make those Orc Hunters, and he'd done a really good job of
nice, yeah,
putting the Catachan Orc Hunters together, and he'd painted tattoos on them and all kinds of stuff. Man, that was proper. There
was some really, really interesting kind of mini codexes for 3rd edition as well. They did. Armageddon lists, Eye of Terror lists, so you can get like Ulthway Strike Forces and Steel Legion and Orc Speed Boys and Kroot Mercenaries, and there's all sorts of really weird Orc Wild Boys, loads of stuff in 3rd edition for you to kind of kit bash and convert to your heart's content. And also there are vehicle, not that we're really interested in playing big enough games for vehicles, but there are vehicle construction rules in 3rd as well, which allow you to kind of kit bash your own vehicles and kind of create rules for them, whether they just become part of a narrative scenario or transport vehicles or tanks or anything like that,
Yeah, and I could spend hours just making army lists with these codices. Yeah. It's just a lot of fun just putting 500 points together, if anything. So I mean, at this point in time, we each have a force of 500 points or so. What are you bringing to Nothos?
I have decided to create a Space Wolves force, from the Space Wolves Codex. The jumping off point is it's going to be a group of Space Wolves who worship Russ, as I'm sure they all do, but these guys really worship Russ to the point where they no longer feel that they want to worship the Emperor. Heretical, some might say, of course. However, this particular faction of Space Wolves is following what they believe Russ wants them to do before he disappeared in the Eye of Terror, chasing Chaos bad guys. So they've basically gone against the Imperial kind of creed and going off doing their own thing. They're still fighting Chaos and fighting Orcs and Tyranids and all that sort of stuff, championing for humanity, but they're just doing it in their own way. So they're technically renegades because they're no longer kind of beholden to the Inquisitors and stuff like that. Even though the Space Wolves have always been getting into trouble with that. I used to wind Space Wolves players up for years and years saying they were basically Chaos Marines, which they essentially are. So this is me putting my money where my mouth is and making these guys essentially Chaos Marines. They won't be worshipping Chaos. I won't be putting any demons in the army or anything like that. They will be run as a straight Space Wolves army list, but they've distanced themselves from the Imperial creed.
Yeah, the Wild Wolves. And give us a quick rundown of your army list. What have you got in there?
So at 500 points, it's interesting, the Space Wolves army list builds very differently than a regular Space Marine list. It basically allows you X amount of HQ choices, depending on how many points you're playing, and then you kind of build your army around those HQ choices, almost like you would put warriors and retinues around heroes in a kind of Viking band. And at 500 points, we're only picking one HQ choice, so of course I have to have my kind of bog standard Wolfe battle leader, who, if we get bigger games, will be surrounded by his kind of personal retinue, but at the moment he's an individual character who is kind of leading this rather large motley band. They've got their own starfleets and not starfleets. They've got their own vessels so they can travel and stuff. I mean, it's not only 20 guys. It's the equivalent of a company, which will grow and shrink, but I can get more into the background of that. So yeah, there's a HQ choice, and then I've got enough points to have 2 squads of Grey Hunters, 2 6-man squads of Grey Hunters, and a 3-man assault squad. Which the way that you buy them is it's a bike squad, Blood Cause bike squad, but instead of having them on bikes, I've got them with jump packs.
I was going to say 3-man assault squad. So that must be pretty beastly to just be the three of them, I guess, and they're pretty well equipped.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can put a lot of plasma pistols and stuff in it, but one of the good things about plasma pistols in 3rd edition is they still explode when you roll a 1, so they're very dangerous to use a lot. And also, traditional Space Wolves don't really like using jump packs, which is another reason I really wanted to put them in my army as a kind of nod to the idea that regular Space Wolves wouldn't really use jump packs. So to push myself away from that kind of Space Wolf idea of kind of just a 3-man assault unit. They kind of been designed as they would be the guys who would go hunting down, a Carnifex or a Rhino or a Land Raider or something big that they could fire their plasma guns at.
I really like that idea. I'm looking forward to seeing how they turn out when they're all done.
So that's my force anyway. Now you can introduce us to yours now.
I have put together a Adeptus Sororitas force. I'm doing 500 points of Sisters of Battle. I'm using Chaos bits to make them Chaos Sisters of Battle. I used a Demonettes sprue along with these updated Sororitas box that's come out to put these together. So they are Chaos Undivided. So they aren't in worship of any particular god, which gives me a bit more freedom in terms of the kit bashing side of things, to going through my bits and finding out what works and that kind of thing. But also I think it works well with the kind of nun aesthetic of these girls, because there's a lot of parchments and iconography. And I just finished reading Henry Zoo's Flesh and Iron, which features the Blood Gorgons chapter. And the Blood Gorgons chapter of Chaos Marines are Chaos Undivided, and they're very kind of worshipful, zealous type chapter, and I really like that side of things. Like, they've just found the raw idea of chaos, and they study and worship that rather than any particular one god, and that really appealed to me. So I took that over into this Sororitas army. The idea that they are an Order Dialogus offshoot. So they're initiates who are kind of trained to be scribes and study things, and then when they land on the planet of Nothos to found their mission, they come across a book hidden deep in the catacombs, which is of course some kind of cursed chaos tome. And then, being scribes and young students and initiates, they take this upon themselves to apply their training to this chaos tome. So from the very beginning, from the very founding of their mission on this planet, they are studying chaos without realizing it, and that seeps into everything that they're doing and kind of corrupts their church from the very roots upward. Just with 2 boxes of Battle Sisters, I made 3 squads, 1 of 10 and 2 of 5, and then the Canoness model is the Saint Lucia model from the Triumph for Saint Catherine diorama. If you like Battle Sisters and you haven't yet seen the Triumph for Saint Catherine, go and check that out. It's a really awesome model, and all of the individual little figures on it are really cool in their own ways. And I had a lot of fun picking out which one I was going to use as a HQ. But I settled on Saint Lucia, and I've given her a big scythe and a big cloak, so she looks like a Grim Reaper. And I've got a squad of 5 Celestians, a squad of 5 Dominions, who all 5 of them have melter guns, because I really love melter guns.
Great.
Melter guns are the only thing that GW invented themselves. Everything else already exists somewhere, but melter guns are like an actual...
Smart man's plasma gun, isn't it, basically?
yeah. Smart woman's plasma gun.
Smart woman's, yeah, sorry. Smart person's.
Yeah, and a squad of 10 Battle Sisters accompanied by a priest, and for the priest model I used one of these Chaos Psychers. He's like one of the floating people with the big swollen heads, and I swapped out the head for a Demonette head. So it's an entirely female force of these chaotic nuns, basically. So I suppose what you were saying earlier about how you want a chance to explore the religion and spirituality side of things, I suppose I've given myself the opportunity as well by having this kind of conflict between what they were brought up to do and the thing that they've applied themselves
Yeah, I mean, there's often been a few mentions, especially as Warhammer fluff has had to drill further down into its own core to find fresh material. It has continued to look at, faith and religion and stuff in 40k, but I still think it's something that has got a lot more opportunity there for people who are really into role playing and doing a bit of fluff and stuff like that. And I'm really interested particularly in how Space Marines venerate the Emperor and their own Primarchs and things like that in general. So to have these guys that I'm having they're essentially heretics because they've begun to worship Leman Russ as a god. They've deified him essentially, which is heretical. But then to have these angels of death, which were created as mankind's saviors, to then have that religious difference, I think there's really interesting there. And I want to see how that religion looks on board their space vessels and with all of the other support members of the company. People, new recruits and tech staff and servitors and regular humans who work on the ship. And how does this, where do they worship, how do they worship, you know what I mean? Like that's the kind of things I want to dig into. And there's great opportunity with yours as well to look into how chaos can tempt you and take you down a dark path, and you know what I mean. So which classic Warhammer ideas here, but we can explore them even deeper, which I really want to do. And that's why I think it might be great to do some little role-playing sessions set on Nothos. And we haven't thought about the planet too much yet. I think we've got ideas that it's probably going to be some sort of ancient or decommissioned forge world with huge factories and forges on it, many of which have fallen asleep or are just working on their own and stuff like that, kind of city-sized factories. And we haven't decided whether there's what the native populations look like. They could be ravaging bands of ancestral forge workers, or it could be people living in these factories or anything. We haven't got into that yet, and that's the whole ecosystem of Nothos is something that I'm sure we'll want to detail over time. Yeah,
definitely. I know I like the idea of there being chemical storms and giant, funky coloured lightning and evil dust that swirls around outside the walls of these huge factories. So it's just as hostile outside as inside,
Yeah, absolutely, and that'll allow us to bounce backwards and forwards. But we can create some weather rules, some.
Love it.
For use in the missions, and third edition's good for that as well because it's got an experience system in there. It's got terrain generators, it's got missions in it and stuff. It's it's a one-stop shop, the third edition rulebook, for a load of that kind of stuff, and then we can add our own little rules in for playing outside of chemical storms and playing on the roof of giant tractor buildings and all sorts of mad stuff. You know what I mean? So
love it, mate. Absolutely love it. That's the 40k that is best to me. I think none of this Primaris shit. I want actually the real grimdark Forge World, Death World kind of aspect to it. That's what I'm after. So if listening to this, if this has got your blood up, then get on the Discord and join in the new Forges of Nothos channel that I'm going to have made by the time this episode comes out. And if you just want to make army lists and just send an army list in, and that's it, because I haven't got the time or anything.
Do you know what? We're going to make Nothos, we're going to put it in a position, and we're going to make it big enough that we can come up with reasons why any of the forces that exist in Third Ed could be there. Whether you're Tau or Dark Eldar or Eldar or Orcs or whatever you happen to be, Eldar Harlequins, we don't care. If you want to come up with a reason or you want to kind of shoot ideas around why you might be on Nothos or what you're interested by, great. We want this to be collaborative, don't we?
Yeah. I'm really looking forward to seeing how it develops. Maybe there's relics and artifacts deep within the Forge worlds that people are vying for or something like that. There's always objectives to be captured. So I'm looking forward to that as well. And we'll definitely have to think about doing some 40k role playing with one of the systems. So maybe that's something we'll be talking about in a future episode too, whether it's Wrath and Glory or Dark Heresy or whatever we decide.
I've got some ideas for that, but I'll release them at a later date. So keep stay tuned to this channel for a bit of Forges of Nothos role playing related content.
Oh yeah. We'll have regular updates for you. But now it's time to move on to the film and music segments to round off the end of this episode. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's great. It reminds people that we don't just spend our entire time reading role-playing games and building models, which we don't. But yeah, it's always nice. So I'm keen to do. We haven't done it feels like we haven't done a music and movie section for a little while. So I've been looking forward to this.
Well, we have a bit of trouble deciding what to release at certain points. Like the last episode, we had such a great chat on the open call-in. We just decided that was going to come out in itself. So yes, it has been a while since we've stuck to our original format, but it does exist. The film that you brought to the table this time was Species, 1995.
Yeah, so as you quite rightly said, Species was the first in the franchise to come out in 1995. It had been conceived of and went through various kind of planning since the kind of 1987, I think it was first conceived. Directed by Roger Donaldson. He has done more stuff, but nothing else in his filmography really jumps out at me, if I'm honest.
Yeah, he did Dante's Peak, but otherwise he didn't really do much else.
No. But I think it's probably more famous for some of the cast that's in it. So Natasha Henstridge plays the alien in it. Obviously, this is an alien movie for those people who haven't seen Species. We'll get into basic plot in a minute. But also, it's got Forrest Whitaker and Michael Madsen in it as part of the crew put together to take down this alien. So the basic premise on Species is that after some sort of extraterrestrial contact, humans gain the ability to, a select group of scientists gain the ability to kind of mess around with DNA and create an alien, if you will. Cut a long story short, they decide to create a female version of it. It's really weird. They create a female so it's more docile, right? Apparently. Fools. That doesn't go well for them. And they eventually, they create an alien and it breaks out. That's the default plot of the movie, and a group of adventurers are put together with separate skill sets in order to hunt down and stop the alien from reproducing and kind of killing and running amok, basically.
Yeah, it also had a bit of work from H.R. Geiger in this film, which was always nice to see. The character designs and some sequences, you definitely had his stamp on them. So that's
he did the alien design for Species. Reading around the subject, I kind of knew this a little bit because I love the movie Species, and when I was doing a little bit of research previous to this episode, I was beginning to read into how apparently Geiger had some issues with the movie and thought that the way that it was going was too similar to Aliens, and he had suggested some rewrites and some scene changes and stuff, I think most of which were pretty much ignored, because I think Geiger was pretty hands-off at the time for personal reasons, and he was doing a lot of his work and sending it in remotely and stuff. So even though it's very clear to see it's got that kind of alien aesthetic, I think even Geiger was like, yeah, this is just a bit too similar,
Right, yeah. From what I read, it sounds like the production company really kind of shut him out of a lot of his creative ideas and things he wanted, things he thought would make the movie better. It sounds like they kind of shut him down on a lot of those things, or negated his ideas to some extent, which is a bit of a shame. There's one particular sequence which I'll talk about in a second, but yeah, I like the concept of the alien breaking out, going on a run, and then you have the group of adventurers who are hired and they're all specialists in their own area, and they're kind of sent off to go after this alien. None of them really know what they're dealing with, and we see that all those guys interacting with each other and that kind of thing. It's very classic investigative RPG scenario, isn't it? That's
one of the reasons I love it, because I can totally imagine running it as a scenario. I think it's got some really interesting concepts. Obviously the alien just wants to procreate, and to stop it, it's going to be dangerous. I really enjoy the fact that one of the characters played by Forrest Whitaker is an empath, so it lends that kind of psychic kind of side to the whole thing, which is an angle that the film would be fine without it, but I think it's a really interesting element to put that character in. Forrest Whitaker plays it wonderfully, and it's a beautiful juxtaposition between the kind of soft-natured, understanding Forrest Whitaker and the hard-nosed, pretty much walked off the set of Reservoir Dogs, Michael Madsen playing the mercenary, which is brilliant because he plays it very cool. And I think everybody is pretty much spot on in their character roles, and I think it just manages to avoid going into kind of farce, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I like the dynamic between the group members, and even there are some scenes like they're staking out a club to see if the alien turns up, and even in those scenes you can see how they would probably gel in real life, or if they were played by players, how you would be role playing them. You know, the nerdy doctor is sitting by himself looking at girls across the bar and not getting any action, and Michael Madsen, the action hero, is getting the girl. But it's not really. It's almost not relevant to the main story. It's just kind of developments, you know. And Marg Helgeberger plays Dr. Laura something, and her character and Michael Madsen's character end up in a romantic engagement with each other. I don't know if that has any bearing on the story, or if it's something that just kind of develops because they're working together.
In the time period, you know, that early 90s, I think an action flick had to have a sex scene anyway, didn't it? And I mean, Species doesn't shy away from that. You know, it is overtly erotic as a piece. You know, so I think you would have that anyway, you know, and I think it's the same reason there's a sex scene in, I don't know, Terminator, do you know what I mean, and stuff like that. Like, it doesn't need one, does it? Let's be honest, but there's one in there. It's the 90s, isn't it? You know what I mean? So you want to see a bit of bare ass in a shower or something, you know, everybody wants that. So
yeah, right. But yeah, it reminded me of a film called Under the Skin. Have you seen that?
I haven't seen that, no.
Because you've got this alien girl navigating her way through an environment she's unfamiliar with and learning about it, while also trying to prey on specifically men. There's a lot of parallels with this film Under the Skin, which came out in 2015.
Is this a Scottish one?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, right, okay. Do you know what? I've read about it, but I haven't watched it.
Right.
Any good?
Yeah, it's well good. Yeah, definitely
okay.
worth a watch.
Right, okay.
Yeah, it's really good. It's very creepy. Scarlett Johansson plays an alien who preys on men, and she basically driving around the outskirts of Glasgow in a transit van, pulling up on the pavement and asking men if they want to like get in the van with her. Essentially, is how she does it. But what I like about when they were shooting the film, that's pretty much how they shot it. They put Scarlett Johansson in a van with some cameras. They had her drive around the outskirts of Glasgow and pull up to Glaswegian dudes walking at home on the street. And, you know, she rolls the window down. She's like, "Do you think I'm pretty?" And obviously they're like, yeah." And then she gets them in the van, and then only once they've shot that scene, if you like, do they then say, "By the way, this was for a film. Would you like to sign your name here, and we'll carry on shooting with you now that we've done this kind of intro scene." So as Scarlett Johansson's driving around Glasgow preying on men, all those scenes, there's a few of them, those are legitimate unscripted scenes.
I can only imagine the outtakes of that. The unfilmable parts of that.
Yeah. Funny. But it's a really good idea, and the film itself is really creepy. The way that she
right, I'll check that out.
Yeah, worth watching, Under the Skin. But I think one of the main differences is that you get a sense of, in Under the Skin's case, you get the sense of what Scarlett Johansson is doing from the beginning, and that she is very aware of herself. What I liked about Species, when it starts, when we first meet Syl, the alien, she's a little girl, and they're trying to put her down, they're trying to kill her, and she breaks out of containment, runs off, jumps on a train, heads to Los Angeles, and it's only when she's on the train that she metamorphoses into the kind of killer alien that is advertised on the promotional posters, that they've been marketed by, that the whole story revolves around.
Yeah.
But we first see her as a quite innocent girl, and there's that horrible scene in the train where she starts transforming, and there's this, she's probably like a teenage girl, I don't know, like 12 or 13 or something, and the special effects kick in. They're done really good for the time, but you know, her bumps start raising on her hands, and she goes to look in the mirror, and her face is all distorting, and then tentacles start coming out of her face and stuff, and it's really like harrowing to watch this strange thing happen to this screaming girl, screaming child, essentially. And it's only after she finishes that kind of cocoon phase and she comes out of her cocoon that she has that predatory nature. And that was a really interesting start for me, because they don't bill her as the villain from the beginning. You see her as an innocent. We meet her as an innocent, and it's only you kind of watch her have to navigate through society hungrily later on. So it gives
it's an interesting point you make, because at no point do I feel like Syl the alien is inherently bad. It's more like an animal.
Yes.
That's working on instinct. It's more like a force of nature that's happening that the characters have to stop, rather than it being an alien, mastermind who is, trying to conquer the world or anything like that. So it is an interesting take to it, because it does feel like they're hunting a beast rather than anything else, like a, alien prisoner or something like that. So
yeah, exactly. And there's even that scene right before she goes through the changes on the train cabin and changes into the full-grown woman. Right before that, there's this nightmare scene with this big nightmare train. She's on a train. She's dreaming of a train, and it's I think it's only like a few seconds. She's running down a train track, and a train comes and runs her over, and then she wakes up. It's only like maybe 5 seconds, but in the original script, that scene was a lot longer. NGM Studios cut it out because they didn't think it was necessary. So H.R. Geiger used his own money to fund the construction and shooting of that nightmare train because he thought it was so integral to the film. And I watched it. I was like, "What the fuck is this? This is well cool. It's like big skulls and big pistons going around. There's like flame coming out of their mouths and stuff. It's proper evocative." And then there's like a shot of worms crawling over each other. It's really It's really like classic horror.
Yeah, it is great. But I agree. It's almost when you look at it and you don't realize, you look at it out of context and you don't realize any of the background to it. You think, how much have they spent for such a short amount of time that this is there? And you just think, what is? Yeah, it doesn't seem to make sense.
Yeah. So it would have been a lot longer. So H.R. Geiger we can thank for putting that in, funding that himself, because he thought it was so necessary. But yeah, and then she gets to LA and then she runs off. I really like how this group of adventurers, they're hot on her tail the whole film. They're never chasing up cold leads. They're always like one step behind her the whole way. I like it when they get to LA and Ben Kingsley's like, Los Angeles, the city of the future. It's like, fuck me.
Do you know what?
Maybe in the 90s, maybe, but not anymore.
There's a lot of feeling that I get from it, like the kind of that seeps through the pores of Species. That reminds me of films like the first Terminator, like Predator 2. You know what I mean? It's kind of got that urban sci-fi monster flick feel to it. And I'm not saying it's up there with Aliens and Predator movies. I'm not trying to get it on that pedestal, but I think that's where it sits for me in my mind, especially the first one, which we're talking about.
Yeah, Michael Madsen's come out and decried the sequels, which I haven't seen.
Well, he's only in the second one. He's in Species 2, which is essentially the same cast. But then by the time... That's the only theatrical release. And then by the time they get to Species 3 and 4, although the fourth one is called something else, they are straight to TV releases, essentially.
Straight to TV release, which is code for bad release.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the second one's got... I'm not as keen on the second one either, but I don't find it terrible, if I'm honest. But it's not as good as the first one. I tend to just pretend the first one is an independent film on its own. I mean, they do kind of set it up for a sequel, but then they don't follow that little plot line with the kind of rats eating the stuff at the end. I think was where it was meant to go for the outbreak to continue, but then they did this whole fucking Mars plot line with the second film, which was just entirely separate. So, but as an addendum to that, just before we move on to music, there is another gaming connection there. West End Games, who were responsible for the first edition of the Star Wars RPG and the Master Book RPG, did a Species role-playing game sourcebook, which was a setting book for their Master Book system. It's a single book. You can probably still find it on eBay and stuff like that. It's interesting because it's got a lot of screenshots from the movie, and it's got a lot of additional art and stuff, and would allow you to take the background and the alien and stuff and the organizations mentioned and adapt them to the modern game of your choice. So for those people who really love Species and we reminded them of how cool it was and they'd love to run a game based on it, then if you really feel like it, then go out and pick up the Species sourcebook.
Yeah, awesome. It suits itself very well to a kind of role-playing game.
Yeah, I think so, and I can totally understand why they did a sourcebook on it. But then again, West End Games were doing sourcebooks for all sorts of different licenses. So
Yeah. It's got a lot of scope purely from the beginning of the film, where they mention the fact that they've created this monster from DNA that was signaled to them from outer space, and then they don't talk about that for the rest of the film, and it just becomes a creature feature. There's like, even with that little seed of plot at the start, there's enough there to do something with somewhere else, you know?
Yeah.
So that's Species. I was 4 years old when that came out, and I remember seeing it on the VHS on the VHS rental shelves in the shop and thinking, what the hell is this? And then when I watched it, I saw the poster and I was like, oh, it's that film from when I used to go in the video stores.
In the Blockbuster.
Well, we had a local one, but on the Blockbuster, yeah.
Oh, right, yeah.
It was like old Bev from down the road who would have a little VHSs in there, and you go in and rent out Smackdown and
I remember when they had like video sections in like newsagents and stuff, like booze shops. I remember when I was little, and either my dad or whoever, they'd gone, to the shop to get either whatever groceries or beer or whatever, and on a Friday, and you can pick a movie, and there was 20 films on the wall, all in large oversized VHS boxes. It's like, and quite often there was just an empty box with the date they were due back on, and you could reserve it like a library. It was so weird, man. What a different time.
Yeah, I remember that, man. I used to be really excited. I used to always go in my eye on certain films and wait for them to come back in so we can get them out. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's weird, isn't it, to think that used to be a thing. Anyway, let's move on. We will finish off the episode with our traditional music section. So thanks for bringing Species, Jamie. This time I brought along the music choice, which I get the feeling I've done a few episodes in a row now. I think we'll have to switch at some point. It's just how it's ended up. So I was conflicted. Originally, I was going to choose the album Crack the Sky by Mastodon because it's 12 years old and it's a good prog metal album, and I was very tempted to talk about it, but instead I chose to talk about something which has had more engagement with our listeners. People ask me a lot about Dungeon Synth. I have a lot of conversations about Dungeon Synth, particularly since I mentioned it. I think it was the first episode we did.
I think it was, yeah.
My friend Christopher Thomas Richardson, who you heard in the lovely intro music at the start there, who we mentioned briefly at the start of the episode, I have lots of conversations with him about this kind of thing as well, and people in the Discord like Dungeon Synth recommendations. So I decided that I would talk about Jim Kirkwood for this section. Jim Kirkwood is an electronic musician who is a bit of a pioneer in Dungeon Synth back in the late 80s. So very good setting music for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplaying, for example. Apparently he was in black metal before the late 80s, but I can't find any evidence of that. This guy's a very enigmatic character, this Jim Kirkwood. There's not much evidence of him around, but he has a very prolific discography. He's done, I think, 80 plus albums at this point of electronic ambient music, fantasy ambient, dark ambient, soundscapes and that kind of thing. There's a lot of fantasy elements in his earlier work, and I think after about 2012, according to this one biography that I can find of him, he went through some kind of born-again Christianity awakening, and all of the music that he's made after that is very kind of orchestral and kind of choral, and is good in its own way, but my recommendation is his earlier works. Anything by Jim Kirkwood in the 90s. He's got an album called Middle Earth, and I think it's like an hour and a bit.
It's interesting because it sounds like his discography is like climbing through Dante's versions of hell as he's getting like more and more enlightened as he's going to be doing angelic music before he finishes.
Yeah, that's pretty much what it's like. Yeah, there's a lot of Tolkien in what he's in his kind of. If you just read through the album names, you can pick out references to various fantasy things. He did a 40-minute release called Tales from a Melniboné Tavern.
Nice.
So there's some Elric in there as well. And I'm certain amongst the other millions of albums and song titles he's done, there's going to be some references in there that aren't immediately obvious. There's lots of sentences and strange fantasy words, but I think Jim Kirkwood strikes that balance that Dungeon Synth listeners like so much, between having something that you can leave on in the background, having something that has its own character and personality, and having something that is evocative of a certain time, whether that's by using synths to make the sounds or kind of forming these soundscapes. Jim Kirkwood does a really good job of balancing all that, because a lot of Dungeon Synth leans too heavily one way, and you might get to the point where you're listening to it and you can tell this guy really wanted to go heavy on the synth but doesn't really know how to let the instruments speak for themselves in their own time. Yeah. Where or not to bring the volume down for a bit, if you know what I mean. Jim Kirkwood's stuff is very good at sitting in the background like wallpaper for an RPG session. It will kind of colour the environment you're painting without being overbearing. There's a lot of artwork for the older stuff that's really classic, kind of. Some of it's really Arthurian and kind of chivalric. He's got some knights slaying dragons and that kind of thing. So you can tell whoever this guy was in the 90s, it's even from listening to the releases, it's like you can just hear this legit guy sitting in his room with all his sequencer boards, reading fantasy novels and then making music out of it. It just feels like really kind of DIY. You can hear the soul in what he's doing, which is very rare for electronic music, I think.
Right.
To be honest, one of the reasons why I don't listen to much electronic music is because I find a lot of it to be soulless, and that's not the case with Jim Kirkwood stuff. But for role-playing music, specifically for fans of Dungeon Synth, I don't think you can go wrong with checking out at least one or two of the earlier releases from Jim Kirkwood's discography.
I mean, is his stuff easily available on, say, like, Spotify or iTunes or whatever?
No, it's not. You have to go onto YouTube probably to get some of the earlier stuff. Okay. Dungeon Synth Archives is a great channel for Dungeon Synth on YouTube. Okay. This guy, he has almost no online presence at all. So he's not on Spotify. I can't speak to iTunes because I don't use that. But there's no pictures of him. He hasn't got a website anymore. His only presence really is the releases that he puts out. He does have a Bandcamp, so you can buy his entire discography off Bandcamp for like £130 or something.
Right. Okay.
And he even put out a release this year. He put out a release 2 months ago. So wherever he is, he's still working away on his stuff. But as you joked earlier, he's very much more kind of religious in theme now.
You'll have to forgive my ignorance, but on Bandcamp, if you're purchasing his stuff, is that just like a download, or is that actual? Is it CDs, or does he do cassettes, or?
Bandcamp is a digital file purchase.
Right. Okay. Right.
But he does have a lot of cassettes and CDs that I believe are available as well.
Right. Somewhere.
I think he sells. Yeah. Somewhere.
If you can find a guy.
Yeah. His early stuff was all on cassette, but I'm sure an original pressing of a Jim Kirkwood release must be pretty expensive at this point. He's a kind of folkloric character in the scene. I was thinking about the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings film.
Oh, love that film.
Yeah, listening to his album Middle Earth and trying to picture the soundtrack to that film is really kind of like big band.
Yeah, I love the soundtrack to that.
The way he does stuff. Obviously, it's one man, so it doesn't have the same kind of epic feel to it like that Ralph Bakshi film sound does, like the Helm's Deep theme, that kind of thing. It's very different to that, but it's kind of low, understated, kind of brooding melodies that he kind of sprinkles in throughout these soundscapes. I think would work really well for that Ralph Bakshi film, because the way they animate the backgrounds and stuff, it's quite a dark film, isn't it?
Yeah, there was some, especially when with the orcs and the Balrog and stuff. I mean, it's pretty dark, and the ring wraiths.
So it's if you like that kind of aesthetic, this music, I think his Middle Earth album was from 1990. This kind of music would fit really well to that. I think that's my opinion anyway. If that's the sort of game that you like to run, or if you want some music on while you're reading a book or something, then I would recommend Jim Kirkwood's early 90s stuff. Nice.
You know what? I'm gonna listen to. I've never listened to any of his stuff, so I'm gonna make an effort to put some on YouTube this week and see. So that's cool. Well, I think that's us pretty much done for another episode. We've got a lot more that we want to bring up, but time is ticking on. So we've got more of the call-in material that we're going to release at some point. Don't know when that's going to be. We've got quite a lot. I think we're going to discuss between ourselves how often we're going to do that, aren't we? Because we don't want to back up too much content.
That's the thing. We end up sometimes with more hours of stuff than we know what to do with. So we've got to kind of balance that out to some degree. But that doesn't mean that you should hesitate to call in when we do have them open up, or send us messages and stuff like that. We'll definitely get around to trying to chat about them in the Discord or on the next episode or wherever it might be. So definitely do keep in touch, guys.
And there's a few guests we're kind of thinking about as well, isn't there? So we're not going to mention any names yet, but some people we do know and some people we kind of don't know. So yeah, I think it is as well in our closing statement. I think it's going to be worth mentioning to watch out on the Instagram and the Discord. We're going to potentially be running some more sessions of one-off RPGs. I know I certainly am. I know you might be as well. I know what you mentioned earlier in the episode. We're going to basically dictate a time and a day, and if people are free to come and play a one-off session with us, that'll be great. And you can get in touch with us at the Instagram or come onto the Discord, and we'll be kind of hunting for players that way. So just running little one-shots of stuff. I bought Troika pretty much when you did, and I haven't ran it yet, so I'm gonna potentially run the Troika adventure out of the back of the book, which will only take one session, which I'll probably get 3 or 4 players for. I might end up running a one-shot of Jackals because the system is easy enough to teach people in 5 minutes and then play an hour or 2. So, but I'll see. No promises as to what it's going to be, but I think Troika would probably be high up on that list.
Yeah, but either way, we'd love to get some games going with some listeners. That'd be fun. At Human Energy Field Podcast, come and give us a follow. Check us out. Thanks for listening, guys. Stay hydrated. Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks.